Think your grocery bill is high? Medieval peasants had it worse. They survived on whatever they could grow, gather, or scrape together, through plague, famine, brutal winters, and non-stop labor. No fancy recipes, no cute plating, just cheap meals that kept generations alive. These are the medieval peasant foods that actually powered the Middle Ages. Simple, gritty, and way more interesting than you'd expect. And at the top of the list is the undefeated champion of peasant survival: pottage. Pottage was less a meal and more a lifestyle. Imagine a house guest who never leaves, except in this case, you actually want them to stay because they're keeping you alive. Pottage was a thick stew that sat over the fire for days, sometimes longer. The cooking pot rarely left the hearth. You'd eat some, then toss more ingredients in. New food joined the party, old food slowly disappeared. It was the medieval version of a never-ending buffet, except the buffet was one pot, and the options were whatever we have. At its core, pottage was boiled grain, barley, oats, or rye, cooked down until it turned into something between soup and porridge. Then came the vegetables: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, peas if you were lucky, herbs for flavor, garlic, parsley, sage, anything you could grow or find. On special occasions, you might drop in a small chunk of bacon or salt pork. Not enough to make it a meat stew, just enough to perfume the whole pot with fat and flavor. That little ribbon of grease on top? That was luxury. That was calories. That was survival. Pottage wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, and reliability is what medieval peasants needed more than anything. But pottage had a best friend, something so essential it basically ran the entire medieval world: bread. Medieval peasant bread was nothing like what most of us picture. Forget fluffy white slices, forget soft crusts. Peasant bread was dark, dense, and heavy enough to qualify as building material. It was usually made from rye or barley, grains that could grow in poor soil where wheat struggled. And because peasants didn't always have easy access to mills and fine flour, they stretched their dough with whatever they could: ground peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, sometimes even things that shouldn't be in bread at all when times got desperate. Peasant bread was also famously gritty. Grain was ground using stone mills. Those stones chipped over time and tiny fragments ended up in the flour. So people weren't just eating bread, they were eating bread with micro rocks. That's one reason medieval teeth were often worn down like sandpaper got involved. And here's the nightmare detail: rye could be infected with ergot fungus, which caused hallucinations, burning sensations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Whole communities could be affected at once. Imagine an entire village losing its mind because the bread was cursed. Yet bread mattered so much that it was treated as sacred. You didn't waste it. You didn't casually throw it away. Stealing bread was punished harshly because bread wasn't just food, it was survival compressed into a loaf. Now, what happened when bread supplies ran low and pottage ingredients got thin? That's when peasants met the most depressing food on the medieval menu: gruel. Gruel is what happens when you take the idea of food and dilute it until it becomes a suggestion. It was grain boiled in water, extremely thin, extremely bland, and absolutely essential during famine. The recipe was brutally simple: a small amount of oats or barley scraps drowned in water, boiled until it became something you could swallow. If you had salt, great. If you didn't, enjoy your warm, watery sadness. Monasteries feeding the poor could stretch a single cup of oats into enough gruel for 10 people. That's not a meal, that's a survival tactic. Gruel was also medieval health food, not because it was trendy, but because it was all you could keep down when you were sick. Too ill to chew? Too weak to digest? Here, drink this bowl of barely nutrition and try not to die. Kids were often weaned onto gruel too, meaning generations grew up with a first solid food that tasted of disappointment. When grain was available, gruel was the backup plan. When grain wasn't available, things got even desperate, so peasants leaned on vegetables that could survive almost anything. The MVP of medieval poverty produce? Turnips. Turnips were cheap, hardy, and they grew in soil that would make other crops give up. They had a short growing season, needed little attention, and could be stored for months. Turnips went into stews, into pottage, boiled on their own, mashed, roasted in ashes. Whatever worked. The roots fed you. The leaves fed you. Even the flowers could be eaten when spring arrived. A family could store turnips in cool cellars or underground pits lined with straw and keep them edible deep into winter. In a world without refrigeration, that was power. Eating turnips constantly had one major downside. Your soul started to leave your body from boredom. But peasants weren't eating for fun. They were eating to get through winter. And if turnips were the backbone, cabbage and onions were the flavor. Cabbage was a peasant supercrop. A single head could grow huge and feed a family for days. Outer leaves could be picked while the plant kept growing. It was like food that replaced itself. Better yet, cabbage could be preserved by souring it. Medieval people were making versions of sauerkraut long before it got trendy. A cabbage pit full of fermented cabbage could keep families alive through months of cold weather. Onions were perfect partners. They grew easily, stored well, and made everything taste more like a real meal. Together, cabbage and onions turned basic food into something that actually had a personality. They also turned peasant homes into gas chambers. Medieval writers complained about the belly troubles from cabbage meals, and some places even had rules about when cabbage could be served, because the aftermath wasn't polite company. But peasants kept eating it because it worked. Now, vegetables and bread keep you full, but peasants needed strength. Long days in the field demanded something bread alone couldn't provide: protein. That's where peas and beans came in, quiet heroes of the medieval diet. Dried peas and beans stored well, carried real nutrition, and could keep a person going through brutal labor. Peasants soaked them overnight, boiled them soft, and mashed them into thick pastes. It looked like baby food, but it powered 12-hour workdays. Monasteries relied on peas and beans heavily too, especially during religious fasting periods when meat was banned. In some places, meat-free days made up a huge chunk of the year, so legumes weren't optional, they were essential. Of course, peas and beans came with the same medieval side effect as cabbage: atmosphere. Health guides warned against eating too many beans before church or court appearances, which is medieval language for "don't show up loaded with pea paste unless you want to become a local legend." Now let's talk about meat, because peasants did eat it, just not the way you're imagining. If nobles ate roast venison and fancy poultry, peasants ate the parts nobody wanted: offal. Organs, heads, feet, tongues, cheeks, blood, anything that could be cooked, boiled, fried, or stuffed into a casing and called food. But peasants weren't dumb. They were experts at turning scraps into meals. Pig heads were valuable. Cheeks had real meat. Ears could be cleaned and crisped. Blood became blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked. During butchering days, nothing went to waste, because waste meant hunger later. And when times got truly bad, peasants ate whatever they could catch: small game, squirrels, birds, sometimes animals nobody would touch in good times. The rule wasn't, is it tasty? The rule was, will it keep us alive? For communities near the coast or rivers, there was another cheap protein that became medieval fast food: salted herring. Herring was caught in massive numbers and preserved with salt in barrels. It traveled far inland, it lasted, it required little cooking, and it mattered even more because of religious rules. When the church banned meat, fish was still allowed, so half the year, medieval Europe basically ran on salted fish and bread. The downside? The smell, the thirst, and the legendary herring breath that probably ended more romances than war ever did. And after that salty meal, peasants needed something to drink. But water wasn't always safe, so they drank ale. Small beer, usually, low alcohol, just enough to preserve it. Safer than water, because brewing required boiling. Everyone drank it. Adults, teenagers, kids. It wasn't about getting drunk,
It was about not getting sick.
A lot of workers even received ale as part of their pay. You could work all day and get coins and gallons of ale. Medieval benefits packages were simple: money, drink, survive. In areas with apples, peasants also made cider because apples don't store long, but fermented apple juice does. Cider could last for months. Stronger batches were saved for celebrations, weaker batches for everyday drinking. And then there was the rare sweet luxury: honey. Sugar was an expensive import most peasants never saw. Honey was the real sweetness of the medieval world, local, precious, and useful for everything from food to medicine. People risked stings gathering wild honey. Some kept simple hives. A good hive could produce enough honey to make a family feel rich for a moment. Sweet porridge, sweet bread, maybe even a small batch of mead on a holiday. Berries were another seasonal gift, free sweetness if you had time to gather them. But without sugar, preserving them was hard, so berries stayed a short-lived treat. And when crops failed, peasants turned the forest into an emergency pantry: chestnuts and acorns. Chestnuts were the better deal: naturally sweet, easy to roast, boil, or dry and grind into flour. In some regions, chestnuts were so important they were called the bread tree. Acorns were harder. They had bitter tannins, so peasants had to soak and rinse crushed acorns repeatedly to make them edible. It was slow, annoying, and absolutely worth it if the alternative was starving. In famine years, people fought over access to nut-gathering grounds. That's how valuable forest food became. Wild greens were another lifeline: nettles, dandelion greens, sorrel, wild garlic, ramps. Knowledge mattered. One mistake with mushrooms could kill you, but a skilled gatherer could keep a family alive when stored food ran out. And then, at the very bottom, when there was barely anything left, came the last line of defense: ash cakes. Primitive flatbreads made from whatever meal you could scrape together: grain dust, ground roots, acorn meal, mixed with water and cooked directly in hot ashes. No oven required, no tools required, just fire, paste, and desperation. They were smoky, gritty, bitter, and sometimes literally mixed with ash. But they delivered calories, and calories were life. Here's the real secret of medieval peasant food. It wasn't about recipes, it was about improvisation. The best medieval dish wasn't a dish, it was whatever we have. Spring might be wild greens and the last turnips. Summer might be garden vegetables with a tiny bit of bacon fat. Fall might be cabbage and mushrooms. Winter might be dried peas, stale bread, and whatever survived storage. Peasants weren't eating 3 perfect meals a day. Often it was one main meal after work, maybe something small in the morning. One-pot cooking wasn't trendy. It was practical. Keep the fire going, keep the pot going, keep the family alive. And that's the part people miss when they romanticize medieval life. Peasant food wasn't glamorous. It wasn't meant to impress. It was engineered by necessity: cheap calories, storage, survival, repetition, and a constant battle against hunger. So yeah, your grocery bill is high, but at least your dinner doesn't have to last for a week in the same pot. At least your bread doesn't come with hallucinations. And at least whatever we have isn't your entire lifestyle. Because medieval peasants didn't eat like that for fun. They ate like that because tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, and dinner was the closest thing they had to security.